Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jim Hodges. I'm president of McGuireWoods Consulting and a partner in the McGuireWoods law firm. A few words about your host. McGuireWoods is a leading international law firm with over 1,000 lawyers in 25 offices worldwide. We continuously rank among the top firms in the Financial Times' prestigious North America Innovative Lawyers Report, and the firm has been recognized 14 times on BTI Consulting's Client Service A team, a lead firm singled out for client service excellence based on unprompted feedback from clients and major companies. McGuireWoods Consulting is the consulting arm of McGuireWoods, which operates throughout the United States with over 100 consultants located in 8 states and Washington, D.C. Our focus is state and federal lobbying, the sales of goods and services to government enterprises, strategic communications, and infrastructure economic development. Our discussion today will include a combined effort of the outstanding economic development teams of the McGuireWoods law firm and McGuireWoods Consulting. Now I will turn the program over to Margaret Rockwell, who will moderate the remainder of our program.
Hello to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Margaret Rockwell, and I am an Assistant Vice President on the Infrastructure and Economic Development team at McGuireWoods Consulting. I'll be moderating today's webinar, and I'm very excited to introduce our presenters. Today on the call, as you just heard, we have Governor Jim Hodges, who you heard from a moment ago. He is President of McGuireWoods Consulting, and we will be talking about engaging with elected officials on economic development agreements. Lloyd is a Senior Vice President in McGuireWoods Consulting's Richmond office and leads the Infrastructure and Economic Development team. He will be discussing reputational and business risks associated with incentives. Benton Blaine is a Vice President in McGuireWoods Consulting's Charlotte office, and he specializes in site selection, incentives negotiation, and public-private partnerships. He will walk through a risk analysis and a general compliance overview, then we'll discuss public policy strategies for mitigating the risks discussed. Nancy Little is a partner at McGuireWoods LLP and specializes in finance and real estate transactions. She will be discussing contractual concepts such as force majeure and various provisions to look for in your contract to mitigate risk. A recording of this webinar will be emailed to all registrants tomorrow, so please keep a lookout for that email in case you would like to revisit this webinar in the future. We'd love to hear from you if you have any questions for our presenters today. You may type your questions in the box at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer these questions at the end of the webinar. We will have about 10 minutes for questions and answers. Thank you, Chris, for beginning our discussion today. I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Margaret. And it's a pleasure to join my colleagues here at McGuireWoods Consulting and the McGuireWoods Law Firm to walk through an item of interest to, I think, many companies that have worked over the past decade or so to get economic development incentives related to their job creation or incentive activities in states at the local level or at the state level, and now may be facing challenges as a result of the economic crisis created by the COVID situation of meeting some of those commitments. Many of these commitments will take place not just within a year, but some of the commitments may go 3, 4, 5, 10 years out. And so commitments that you made back when the economy was roaring may be very challenging to meet, and they would have very significant reputational and business risks associated with that. You know, heading into this pandemic, incentives were already getting a lot of attention in the media. Look at the situation that Amazon faced in New York. Look at the situations that other companies have faced all across the country. You had concerns in Austin and Nashville with the communities already saying they were not going to provide incentives anymore. And so there was already a great deal of public scrutiny with regards to economic development incentives from both the political left and the political right. In fact, I referred to it as a war on economic development, that you had a number of forces unifying, saying that incentives were draining public coffers of money that was necessary for either valuable public services or that we were supporting corporate welfare. Now, typically, when the economy falters, and you look at whenever we've gone into a recession, those charges or concerns regarding economic development incentives usually wane. And people are more willing to embrace public policy initiatives to support economic development incentives. We're not sure that will necessarily be the case in this situation. Not only has the rhetoric regarding economic development incentives, particularly within the past few years, gotten more intense, but just look at the scrutiny that's been given to companies that have received money under the Paycheck Protection Program and the concerns that we are using federal dollars or scarce state dollars to subsidize large corporations. And in fact, many of those companies are ones that have also received economic development incentives from companies. And you're seeing the public demanding that that money that companies have received for retaining jobs is being required to be paid back. So imagine now if you are a company that's received economic development incentives, you're having compliance problems, and you want to come forward and ask for some sort of forgiveness or abeyance to those requirements, what kind of public outcry could come with that? Remember, incentives are going to be competing now with money for other scarce public needs, not only to support small businesses, which are facing the fight of their lives, but also for health care, public safety, and other needs that people want. And when you ask people, well, do you support money for economic development incentives going to large corporations, or should we be supporting our health care professionals, you can imagine what the polling would look like. So, there's a very charged political environment right now that creates a great deal of not only political and public relations risks, but also, we believe, a number of regulatory risks for companies. If you are going to lose anticipated benefits that you as a company may have already booked, can you imagine what the earnings reporting consequences of that, or the tax consequences, or the other implications that you may have to report to Wall Street, that suddenly money that you were expecting or had already banked would have to be paid back? That could have significant implications for a company that has to be reported, that could impact stock price and other issues far more serious than just the political and public relations risks are associated with this. So our point with this is that you need to handle these sorts of situations delicately, professionally, and with a unified policy and legal approach. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Benton Blaine, who will walk through some of the issues that are associated with determining whether you have risk and how to analyze that. Benton?
Chris, I appreciate the introduction, and thank you for the attendees that are on the line as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about general compliance and give you an overview, and then some public policy strategies to mitigate those risks. So the first thing that we did once we understood that this would be a potential issue for our clients is see if there was a way to narrow where we can focus. And we tried to do that from a geographic perspective, but what we quickly came to realize is this is really on a city-by-city, county-by-county, state-by-state basis. So you're going to have to go through each one of those economic development performance agreements to figure out what is your exposure. So that's the bad news. Good news is we've kind of come up with a decision tree that can help you, at least at that initial level, to determine what is your exposure. So first things first. Do you have an active economic development incentives agreement? If the answer is yes, we can kind of skip down to the bottom. But the second piece of that is a little more complicated, is do you have an agreement that is still in a maintenance period? So we regularly see with states, once an economic development incentives agreement is completed, there's a period of years, generally 3 to 5 years, that you may have to maintain those employees before that program is truly closed and you have no more exposure. So in a situation where we had a 10-year state agreement plus a 5-year compliance period, which is fairly common, if you were to default or close that period, we're now talking about paying back funds that you may have received in 2006 or 2007. So the exposure is fairly material on those. So the second one is, once we went through and figured out what active agreements do we have, and then what agreements are still in a maintenance period, we have to figure out, are we in compliance? And again, we have to go through and look into that agreement. I'm going to use the 500 employee project kind of as a generic one today, understanding that clients on the call are going to have smaller projects and some may have much larger projects, but that'll be our generic. So you have to see what you're tied to from a legal perspective. So understanding that you may have announced a 500 employee project or something larger, or you may have that in your notes, you need to see what you're contractually obligated to. North Carolina, for instance, allows for a 10% margin of error in almost all of their economic development agreements. Most of our clients know, however, you can actually negotiate up to a 20% margin of error. So most are at 450, some of our clients are down to 400, but it's on a state-by-state basis. So if you look out in Utah, their performance-based incentives, it's only a 50%, it's a 50% margin of error. So now we only have to have 250 employees to stay in compliance. So that's the good news. The second one is what counts as an employee. And this is something that really has popped up in about the last 10 days. It's, can you count employees that are furloughed that still have benefits? And that's really a legal question, but to sum it up, likely not. It's something you may be able to use it from a negotiation perspective, but if you read the definition of an employee in your contract, more than likely that is not going to count. The second piece, now that we figured out what job number are we going to be held to, we have to understand when is that going to be counted. So we pulled most of the states in the last 7 days, and what we understand is most of those compliance periods are calculated on 12/31, so end of the year. That's good news for most of the people on this call, because we can maybe not get completely post-COVID, but we can get a lot closer to it, get those employee and job numbers back up, and not be in a default situation. However, we did find there was a material amount of states that view this on a monthly or quarterly basis, which means if we had a really bad Q1 or we know we're going to have a bad Q2, we may either know we're A, destined for a default, or B, we may have already defaulted. And there's likely going to be some notice provision that if you have defaulted, it's going to trigger a chain of events and you have a certain amount of time to enact those events. So all the more reason to jump on top of those engagements now and figure out where you sit. What we also found is there's a lot more agreements at the local level. So think your property tax abatements that are viewing employee requirements on a quarterly or monthly basis. So even though your state, and that's generally where we think about job and job requirements, may be in good shape, you still may have a different requirement at the local level and could have defaulted. Now, the second half of this equation is our incentive realization. And I think Utah does a really good job of outlining this potential issue. So most states are going to calculate your incentives based on payroll or payroll taxes or some equation that includes both of those. But if you have a situation like in Utah, which again only requires 50% compliance, so 250 jobs out of that 500, if you come in with 250 jobs, we've now cut our incentive numbers in half. So that's going to trigger some sort of communication with tax and finance because we're now materially below what we estimated. If we amalgamate that company-wide, include a couple defaults, we see in a worst-case scenario for some large companies, there could be 8-figure reductions year over year in the amount of incentives realized. So now we come up with something very material that I think Chris alluded to earlier. Okay, so we've walked through this and we've understood, how many jobs do we have to hire? When is that going to be viewed? And then we've also understand how is that going to affect the incentives that we want to pursue. What are your options? And this is where we get into a public policy perspective. How can you go forward? Well, the first step is going to be a status quo. If you're on this call, that likely doesn't apply to you because that's, hey, we may have some material loss in the form of incentives, but it's likely only on one program. We're going to catch up next year. Everything's going to be fine. The second one is the amend category. We think a lot of companies are going to end up in that. The third one, we classify this as mutual termination. And you should never have a default or a unilateral breach, default termination. If you can clarify it in verbiage perspective, call it a mutual termination, your government relations and your PR team is going to thank you later. It's really going to help you in the eyes of public perception. But we're also seeing unilateral state action that can end up affecting your decision. And so we look at Nebraska, for instance. So Nebraska was extremely proactive and came out and said, hey, any default that occurs because of COVID, we're not going to have any clawbacks because of it. And that's a really good tool to have in the toolbox. So pros, it limits the exposure from going back potentially years or half a decade and paying back those incentives, especially in a time that there's a cash crunch with most of our clients. The con is that is not a one-size-fits-all program. And you may be in a situation where, yes, technically you're defaulting this year, but you're going to catch up next year. The way Nebraska's program is written, you're now out of the program. There is no catching up, and that's the end of that. So just keep that in the back of your mind, and this is not a negative, but I think it's important to understand that city, county, states must, because they're a taxpayer-driven entity, they must do what's in the best interest of city, county, and state. There is a reason that you sit on opposite sides of the table when you're negotiating both for the incentives and also from a legal perspective, those agreement terms. So understand what your options are and how you need to approach it. Some best practices. I think you should, first things first, be in a preserve incentives mode versus a reduce exposure. I think a lot of companies fought very hard for these incentives. They may have spent a lot of money on them. They're counting on them from a tax and finance perspective. They should, take the steps necessary to keep that. In addition to the goodwill and the potential negative publicity associated with the default, they should try to preserve them. I don't want to see companies end up in a fire sale situation where they overreact and their first goal is, we need to reduce our exposure, and so we're just going to mutually terminate everything. That is likely not going to be the solution for you. If it is, it's going to be in a very small scenario. Certainly, if you permanently close down plants or know that that plant is not coming back online for several years, we're going to default, and that's going to be our number one priority, is reducing exposure. But if there's the possibility that that plant is going to come back online, we need to shift back to that preserve incentive mode. What are our options if we get into that amendment category? Couple steps. We can do some sort of small amendment that buys you some extra time. We do think you should make these amendments sooner than later. You should also account when you make this amendment knowing that the future is not uncertain. We could still have a second wave of COVID or some other types of changes. So whatever amendment you negotiate, we don't need to keep coming back to the well. We need to account for that uncertainty now. But this ramps all the way up into, our advocacy team, where if there's a specific state with a specific sector that is going to be exceptionally hard to hit, we can start a grassroots effort. We can amalgamate all those potential affected companies, and we can get some sort of executive or legislative change that's going to avail those companies to a benefit or make compliance easier for them. So you have a sliding scale. I do think that a lot more companies are going to think they're in that, hey, I just need to make a small amendment. They're going to think they're in that category when they're actually not. Before you make any sort of amendment, how we would tackle this issue, we have a 100-plus person team. You're going to hear from a former governor in a second. We also have members from various attorney general's offices, legislative branch, Department of Commerce. Certainly our economic development team has done hundreds of projects. We're going to include that with city, county, state precedent, knowledge of what other states are doing, knowledge from what our other clients are doing. So again, more data is going to be extremely helpful. Then we're also going to look at the city, county, state budget situation. Are they in a good situation? Or, 8, 12, 24 months from now, how is that going to change? And then finally, I think this is the biggest piece that some people are going to overlook. Who can make this change? Is this something that maybe Department of Commerce can make unilaterally? Or is this something that we're going to need a legislative change? And the legislative change, while it may sound scary, it's not. It's something we do every day. For instance, there's some state programs that are mandated can only have a max of 10 years. So if you're in a situation where, you want to suspend 1 year and just add it to the back of the agreement, we're going to have to seek a legislative change because by law it can only be 10 years. That's something we absolutely tackle. We understand that this can be a large lift because you're talking about including, tax, finance, potentially real estate, HR, government relations, legal, all on the same team, especially when people are working from home or worst case scenario, some of those teams are furloughed. But we do think this is something you need to tackle sooner than later. City, county, states are in a let's help companies, grow, expand, stay alive, let's keep our employees employed mode. As Chris alluded to, that could change. We're already seeing a significant amount of lawsuits associated with that Payroll Protection Act. We're seeing, higher review of that program. If you combine that with potential budget shortfalls that are going to hit, at the end of this year, early next year, you could end up negotiating in a very different, environment if you decide to wait. And then the final piece is, and I think this is the most important, so you combine all that information, and you should never ask a question that you don't already know the answer to. So Chris alluded to incentive environments. We're seeing it change over time. You may have negotiated a project in a very pro-incentive, city council and mindset. Don't make the assumption that when you go back to try to renegotiate that you're going to have that same team or same mindset. Make sure who you're reaching out to is going to be one of your sponsors on your team. You don't want to inadvertently give that city council member who is very anti-incentives the exact fuel he needs to flame it, and you could end up on the front page of the paper. So that's a worst case scenario. It will happen to companies who tackle this wrong. So that's a general overview, I think, of the consulting and the advocacy strategies to work through. I'm going to turn it over to Nancy. She's going to give you a little more background from a legal perspective of your options and how you can tackle this as well. So Nancy, why don't you take it away?
Thanks, Benton. And you really got the conversation started on the legal side of things by talking about the agreements, because that's really the beginning point for the legal options that you might have, is to look at your agreement. Assuming that you are not at a memorandum of understanding stage, an MOU, as you know, is typically going to be non-binding. But if you're actually at the agreement stage, look at your agreement. Know your agreement. I know you've had lawyers tell you that many times, but keep reading, read to the end, know what is in that agreement. As Benton mentioned, there are different types of agreements. Some are for grants, which may have some strings attached. Some may be for abatements or tax refunds or credits. Sometimes localities may have provided real property or personal property at favorable lease rates and may be leasing some property to you. There are other types of agreements as well, or you may have negotiated multiple incentives under different agreements, and each one may have different requirements. So know what your rights are, know what the conditions are, know what you have to satisfy, especially know your obligations, know what the time frames are, what are the deadlines for performance. Benton spent a lot of time talking about the job requirements and what the percentages may be for compliance. Know all of those provisions and know, as he said, the answers before you ask the questions. There may be provisions in the documents for extensions already built into the agreement. If you can extend, can you keep all of the, or part of the benefit? How much? Is that worth it to you to do that? Are there offset rights in there? Sometimes localities may have the ability to offset funds that they owe you in exchange for amounts that you may owe to the locality. Is there a force majeure provision? That's gotten a huge amount of attention, as the audience probably knows. If there is, see if it includes epidemic in the litany of force majeures that could occur during the term of the agreement. If there is no force majeure provision, it's unlikely that one would be implied. You might have an argument for impossibility if there are, for example, there's an inability to pull permits, building inspection offices may be closed, governmental planning, zoning processes may be affected, things like that. Typically, always keep in mind that force majeure provisions will excuse performance but not payment obligations. The analogy in some of the leasing and finance models that you've heard come up over the last month are applicable here as well, in that if you have got payment obligations, those typically will not be excused. There may be notice requirements or reporting requirements. You may have to report promptly or even immediately if there are delays in performance or changes in circumstances. A lot of times there are ongoing certifications, which Benton referred to, or representations that there are no defaults, no material adverse change. You don't want to make any incorrect representations or certifications. That will hurt you later on. Termination provisions. The agreements typically provide for termination. What are the procedures? Can one party terminate if the other party fails to perform? Keep in mind that many agreements may also, particularly in the grant context, be subject to appropriations. So in looking at the ability of governmental entities to perform, consulting is always very good about letting us know whether particular grants or programs may be funded or unfunded, or the ability to have those funded, and things may change. So if you're a company that has an incentive agreement, it may be beneficial to the counterparty as well as to you to sit down and talk about what you can do, what they can do, and work out a solution together. Other provisions to consider, there may be provisions for temporary suspension of performance that might allow you to hold funds that you've received in escrow or in a segregated account until you're able to rework the agreement. You'll always want to see what your liability is. Benton mentioned this as well. Is it just a loss of future benefits, or are there clawbacks or recapture rights that would take you back for an extended period where you would have to repay the funds that you have received? Hopefully, even if you do have a clawback, that's the limit of your liability, but you'll also want to check to see if there's liability beyond loss of future benefits or funds that you may have received in the past. If there's a dispute, you'll want to at least look at, ahead of time, the dispute resolution provisions that are in the document. The state law of the state where the project is located will almost always govern, and you will more than likely be in the governmental entity's dispute resolution procedures. Nobody wants that. It's not good for anyone, and it's best for everybody to work it out. Benton and Chris also mentioned confidentiality and publicity. Everybody's seen the PPP program publicity that's come out. Nobody wants to be a part of that kind of publicity. Look at the agreement on what it provides on confidentiality. Talk to your advisors about sunshine laws and FOIA requests and things like that. There may be confidential information that you've shared with the locality. There may be provisions that contemplate joint publicity releases. Look at all of those provisions, know your rights, know your obligations, and also consider state and local laws and procedures that may apply. If there's a package of incentives that you have, consider if working out something on one incentive may affect what happens with another incentive. Are there matching grants at the state and local level, for example? You'll want to look at the whole package and see how one may be affected by the other. The bottom line is have a plan, know what you can commit to do and what you cannot, and take into account the uncertainty of the timing on reopenings, supply chain issues, challenges in rehiring the workforce that may be making more money in unemployment right now than you might be able to pay, uncertainty as to when things might normalize and we might get back to business the way that it was before the pandemic hit. Again, consider the analogies to what's going on in the finance world and in the leasing context. There is a sense right now in a lot of areas that parties may want to enter into standstill or forbearance arrangements until we get a little farther along in the recovery to see what people might be able to do. So you might consider those kinds of temporary solutions or extensions in order to buy time to figure out what's realistic in the long term, and then perhaps a modification of the terms of the agreement with new time frames for performance. It's always important to localities to have the workers retained, which was a big part of the PPP program. So you may be able to, on the company side, you may be able to negotiate for retention of employees, whereas in the prior world that we lived in, it might have been more important to increase employment. So I think both will be important going forward. In summary, pull your team together, include the people that are involved in your project, include people who understand incentives, know your contracts and your agreements, understand your obligations, conditions, requirements, and the time frames. Consider what the risks are and what your sensitivity is to those risks in setting your priorities, and then implement your plan of action, whether it's status quo, renegotiation, termination, suspension, or standstill, and always consider legislative changes. And on that, I'll turn it back over to Governor Hodges.
Terrific, Nancy. Thanks so much for that discussion. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the person sitting on the other side of the table from you, and that's either a governor or a county commissioner or a mayor. But before that, wanted to share my personal experience. I was in office during 9/11, and we had many of these sort of issues come up that were related to external events that caused business people to have to come in and talk about whether or not they could deliver on their performance. And I thought that might be helpful as we discussed how government officials might react and how they might analyze your request for relief or how they might discuss these things. So the first point of reference I would offer is how important it is to communicate early, clearly, and broadly. That is, don't think that simply speaking to a Commerce Secretary is adequate in explaining your situation. Don't think that simply communicating with a governor is adequate. You need to think of all of the stakeholders that are important. Local economic development authorities, county commissions, city governments, mayors, commerce secretaries, governors, regional authorities, all the above. It's quite important when you have an issue that comes up to try to get to those stakeholders early and to communicate clearly what your issues are and what the potential remedies are. I think that's a very important part of all of this, and it's critical that you develop strong relationships with government officials and these other stakeholders so that when an issue like this comes up, you have the right people to call and have the ability to communicate with credibility with those officials. The second piece is that if I'm sitting on the other side of the table, I'm likely to do somewhat of an audit of your company and ask questions like this. What's their investment in my city or county and state? And how long has this company been there? What's their history in terms of layoffs? Have they laid off workers in our state frequently, or have they been a corporate citizen who's had very few layoffs? What is the company's history of offshoring? Do they offshore a lot of their workload, or are they primarily a company that invests either here or in other states in the United States? What is the potential for future investment in this location? That obviously weighs strongly on government officials as they decide whether or not they're going to try to enforce orders or be tough with you. The government official is going to ask, what is the potential for future investment from this company in this location? They'll ask questions like, or they'll think about issues like, what's the employment situation in my jurisdiction? Do we already have high unemployment, or is our location one with relatively low unemployment? And then the last two, which I think are significant questions, will be, how will our existing business community react if we have a disagreement with this company over their incentive agreement? And last but not least, how will this impact our efforts to secure future economic development projects? Will our competitors use how we reacted to this deal against us and our effort to lure potential investment and potential jobs into our jurisdiction? Those are the sort of questions that will be asked by, or questions that come up for government officials and the sort of issues that will come up with them. Now I'm going to kick it back to Margaret Rockwell.
Thank you to our presenters today for your contributions. Turning to some questions that we've received, Benton, one for you. Speaking of compliance assessments and amendments to agreements, are those things that I can tackle at the end of the year or next year once there's more certainty in the market?
Yeah, Margaret, I think that's a great question. I think there's going to be a lot of push maybe from high-level management of, let's kick this can down the road. We have so many fires going on right now, we just can't deal with that. So, and I understand that. You know, this is a time with very fluid dynamics about what companies are doing. That's not the approach I would take, though. You know, as much buy-in as you have, I don't know if our listeners on the call today have a relationship with maybe somebody high up in tax or finance, but I would hold my ground as much as possible. I think you have a negotiating environment that is going to be very pro-business, very pro-incentive. They are going to try to work with you. We've already heard today from Chris and from the governor that may change over the course of the next 12 or 18 months. The actions they take as well, as far as do they lay off, do they furlough, employees, do they still pay benefits, is going to affect what the state does as well. I think if you can get in there early, you're going to get a positive solution. Once these states, and I just saw today, North Carolina is trying to pass another $1.5 billion COVID package. Once these states keep spending money and they're going to see dramatic reductions in sales taxes, DOT is going to be underfunded, states are going to need more education dollars to try to catch up. The budgets are going to be stretched thin. I think you could end up having a public perception sway. So to answer your story, I would try to get in there early. I think you're going to have a receptive audience. I don't know that you're going to have that same audience 12 months from now.
All right, thank you so much. Let's see, Governor Hodges, one for you here. What's the best way to engage with elected officials on projects?
I think the best way to engage government officials on these projects is similar to what Benton just said, and I think many of the other speakers, is communicating early and making sure that you touch base with all the stakeholders. Government officials and agencies are uniquely sensitive to feeling that they're left out or that a business has failed to adequately communicate what's going on. The worst thing that can happen is if a government official, particularly an elected official, reads about layoffs in the paper or hears about them from some other agency. That doesn't work very well. So I think having a strategy around communication and making sure that those communications are timely and that they are issued broadly is very important in dealing with these elected officials.
Okay, thanks so much. And for all the presenters, if you want to contribute to this question, a lot of companies have an internal team that handles some of these matters. What's the advantage to working with these matters outside of our companies and working with your help?
Hey, Margaret, this is Chris. I'll take that first. I think some of the advantages, it does create a bit of an arm's length transaction in that, I think that if you have a third party, that third party, your consultant or your attorney, could address issues theoretically with a potential government actor or public policy person first to see what's going on. I think that person will also, because they do engage regularly in public policy and legal activities, is probably aware of what flexibility a state or local entity is willing to give. They may not have said it publicly, but they've certainly indicated it, and they're probably better aware of precedents as far as some of those issues that the governor talked about earlier with regards to, when they've been willing to give flexibility in the past and when they have not. And so I think they may be in a better position to broach some of those subjects confidentially and quietly before a company puts its reputation on the line and deals with some of those issues.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And let's see, we have another question for Benton. Benton, does this discussion only apply to the COVID-19 era, or can it be expanded?
Margaret, that's a great one, and I appreciate who asked that. So the market was certainly, there were indicators that it was going to change pre-COVID. And so for a company that wasn't experiencing large amounts of growth, coming into Q4 of last year, this could create an opportunity for you to renegotiate any agreements that you had to minimize your risk, minimize exposure, again, while preserving those incentives. This is going to provide a very unique opportunity for you to get some of those key metrics in your favor that, again, you may not see in 6 months, and certainly you didn't see 6 months prior to this. So if you are that company out there, take advantage of it. Certainly we've seen so many negative issues surrounding with COVID. This may be one thing that ends up being a potential positive for you. Renegotiate where you can and preserve that value.
I'm going to echo, this is Nancy, I'm going to echo what Benton said. I think that it's a new world now in the COVID environment, and it could certainly be potentially a win-win. for both sides if you get some extensions, if you sit down and renegotiate some things on both sides. Previously, people were probably in a mode of negotiating a certain way within a certain array of incentives, a certain way that things were done. And post coronavirus, there's the opportunity for people to look at things differently and what's important and what are the time frames that will work. And so it could be a win-win for both sides.
Okay, wonderful. Well, that is all the questions we have for today. Thank you to everyone who have joined us for today's webinar. We hope you've gained some valuable insight in preserving incentives during the COVID-19 era. And we hope you have a great week ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you.